He came to observe, not to believe. The diplomat, flanked by Vatican escorts, seated beneath the fractured light of the basilica's dome, had no reverence in his bones. He was a man of treaties and tactics, sent not for worship, but for watchfulness. His presence at the Mass was political, not spiritual. A symbolic nod from a secular regime, calculated and cold. And yet, he couldn't stop glancing toward the altar. Pope Leo XIV stood there, robed in white, his eyes lowered not in performance, but in prayer. There was no pageantry in him, only stillness, the kind that unnerves men who rely on noise to fill the void. And as the liturgy unfolded, the diplomat waited for boredom to settle in. But boredom never came. As the Eucharistic prayer reached its quiet crescendo, the Pope raised the consecrated host with slow, deliberate hands. Hands that had blessed the dying in refugee camps, had buried children in soil foreign to Rome, had wept behind closed doors where cameras could not follow. And in that exact instant, something shifted in the air. Not metaphor, not atmosphere. The air grew heavy, palpably so, as if gravity itself had deepened. Then it appeared, a figure, immense and burning, formed in silence above the altar. Radiant wings, forged in light. A face no eye could hold, sword lowered, eyes lifted, not toward the Pope, but toward what he held. It was not vision. It was not dream. It was presence. And the diplomat, this trained negotiator, this man of state who had scoffed at miracle and mocked the faith of peasants, fell, not because he meant to, but because his strength betrayed him. His knees buckled under the weight of what he saw. He wept, not out of guilt, not yet, but from the terrible knowledge that everything he had dismissed was real. The others didn't notice at first. The Mass continued, the chant undisturbed. But in that moment, before the entire cathedral, heaven had stepped through the veil, and it stood behind Pope Leo XIV. This was no illusion, no shared hallucination, no convenient myth. And what happened next would change the way thousands would ever approach the altar again. So now, before we continue, ask yourself honestly, would you have believed your eyes? And if this moment had been given to you, would it have changed anything? If you're still watching without subscribing, you need to ask yourself, what is it you're afraid of? Is it truth? Is it change? Is it surrender? Subscribe now, because the next Mass may not wait for your doubts to disappear. And if you still refuse, then say so in the comments. Say what holds you back, but say it plainly. Say it while you can. Pope Leo XIV was a man Rome could never categorize. He was too silent for the media, too merciful for the politicians, and too uncompromising for the cynical faithful who preferred a manageable holiness. He was not the Pope the world had expected, but the one it could not ignore. His intelligence was intimidating. He quoted Pascal and Isaiah with equal ease, yet his prayer life was so simple it unsettled even seasoned cardinals. It was said he once spent 3 hours on a hospital floor praying beside a dying prostitute and never told anyone. The nurses had spoken, not him. He'd written some of the most profound theological documents of the century, not from a marble desk in the Apostolic Palace, but from a hospice bed in Uganda, recovering from malaria contracted on an unannounced visit to a war zone. He had spoken to kings, but listened more intently to janitors. And in the world of high diplomacy, that made him unpredictable. Dangerous, even. He had enemies, not declared, but present. Seated just 2 rows from the front, disguised in diplomatic courtesy and expensive tailoring, was the ambassador for one of Europe's most aggressively secular regimes. On paper, he was there for protocol, to pay respect to the office, to be seen. But in truth, he had been sent to do something else. Not to cause a scene. That would be too crude. His job was more elegant, to reduce the Mass to theater, to observe, report, and, if possible, undermine. He was intelligent, no doubt, trained in law, educated in the elite schools of the West, fluent in 6 languages, though he spoke each as if it were beneath him. He smiled often, but it never reached his eyes. He believed himself immune to religion, not because he studied theology, but because he had dissected it. As a boy, he'd been baptized. As a man, He had baptized his own ambitions and cynicism. And now he was here, in the very heart of Catholic worship, carrying the weight of a mission no one had written down. Undermine the myth by proving there's nothing behind it. The basilica was full that morning, more than full. Dignitaries from dozens of nations, cardinals, diplomats, a few scattered civilians lucky enough to be permitted access. Television cameras were fixed in place. Global news networks had aligned coverage windows to coincide with the Eucharistic prayer. The Pope had chosen the third form of that prayer himself, more ancient, more lyrical, heavier in its language of sacrifice. It wasn't usual for him to override the scheduled liturgical selection, but he had, calmly, without explanation. Perhaps he felt what was coming. The ambassador certainly didn't. He reclined slightly as the first words of the Mass were spoken, adjusting his cuffs with the assurance of a man who'd already decided what he would write later that evening. Another gesture of performance. Another world religion kept alive by nostalgia. But there are some things a camera cannot stage, and some presences that cannot be planned. The liturgy moved slowly, with gravity. The chant curled upward like smoke. The priesthood encircled the altar like silent witnesses to an old covenant still alive. And at the center of it all stood Pope Leo, unmoving, unflinching. This was not theater to him. It was war, not of bullets or decrees, but of eternity pressing into time. And in the moment the host was raised, that pressure broke through. The presence appeared, radiant and unbearable. And the diplomat, the ambassador who was trained to read rooms, decode symbols, and dismiss the supernatural, collapsed under the weight of a reality his government didn't believe in. And still, the Mass continued. The cameras caught everything. The flicker in his eyes, the trembling in his hands, the sweat gathering beneath his collar, the way his breath shallowed, as if the very air had grown too sacred to consume. And yet, this was no private moment. It was public, and it was filmed, which is precisely what should never happen with miracles. Because miracles aren't meant to be televised. They're meant to convert. And now, the world had seen something it could not categorize. Not clearly. Not yet. But soon, millions would watch the footage. Many would deny. Some would mock. But a few, a remnant, would fall silent. And that silence would speak louder than applause. If you're watching this and thinking this is just a story, then ask yourself, why do you want it to be fiction? Why does the idea of something wholly entering history bother you? Because if this happened, and it did, then everything changes. Subscribe now. Not for entertainment, not for content, but because silence in the face of wonder is complicity. And if you won't subscribe, then say so in the comments. Say why this makes you uncomfortable. Say what you can't believe. But don't pretend you weren't moved. Because what appeared above that altar wasn't opinion. It was reality, burning, bright, and entirely uninvited. He tried to regain his composure. The ambassador, once upright, once sure of every gesture, every word, now sat lower in his chair. His spine was straighter than before, but not from pride. From instinct. As if his body feared to slouch in a space now undeniably charged with more than architecture and incense. But habit dies slowly in men trained to doubt. He leaned sideways, just enough to whisper to the Vatican aide seated beside him, an old Jesuit with tired eyes and ears sharp from decades of diplomacy and confession. Does he, the ambassador muttered, barely above breath, really believe bread turns into God? The Jesuit gave no reply, only the faintest tilt of his head, the kind that says, "Listen, you're asking the wrong question." The ambassador pressed on, more irritated now. Or is it just ritual? A performance? Something to keep the faithful under control? The Jesuit turned slightly, his voice like stone worn smooth by time. He believes, he said. The rest is up to you. The words struck harder than they should have, and for a moment the diplomat looked away, feigning interest in the stained glass beyond the altar. But his eyes couldn't rest there. They kept being pulled back to the center, to that man in white, who now knelt at the foot of the altar with such stillness, it seemed the earth might stop turning to watch. The Pope rose slowly, deliberately, and began to speak. Not loudly, but clearly, as if he had heard the whisper or had known it would come. "Control," he said, "not to anyone in particular, but not to no one either. The only king I serve knelt before traitors." A pause, and then, "The Mass isn't power. It's surrender." It wasn't a rebuttal. It wasn't even defense. It was a fact, spoken with the authority of someone who had nothing to prove. A man who had stood in bombed-out chapels and baptized orphans under tarps. But the ambassador wasn't finished. He straightened again, face composed, voice smoother now. Calculated. "Why keep pretending?" he asked, not whispering this time. The microphone didn't catch it, but those nearby heard. "In modern eyes, this is just nostalgia. Dignified. Emotional, sure. But let's not lie to ourselves. It's theater for the lonely. A relic dressed in gold." The Pope turned to him then, not sharply, not with disdain, but with something quieter, something closer to pity, and perhaps invitation. He spoke gently, like a man offering bread instead of argument. "Then come closer," he said. "Stand with me during the consecration. See for yourself what nostalgia can explain." There was no sarcasm, no challenge, only a door left open. But the ambassador didn't move. Not yet, because he wasn't ready to admit that his curiosity had shifted into something heavier. Not fascination, not belief, but discomfort. The kind that comes when a man realizes he might not be the smartest person in the room, because he might not even understand what the room is for. The Pope returned to the altar. The rite continued, but something had cracked. The mask of the skeptic had begun to slip, not from exposure, but from proximity to something ancient, living, and utterly unconcerned with his credentials. And still, the figure above the altar remained, silent, invisible to most but felt, like heat before lightning. If you're watching this and still on the fence, remember, doubt has never made a saint. Wrestling with truth is noble. But mocking what you don't yet understand is cowardice. Subscribe now, while there's still time to listen, because if you wait too long, you may find yourself whispering, "Why didn't I look deeper when I had the chance?" And if you refuse to subscribe, if you'd rather stay where it's safe and clever, then go to the comments and say it plainly. Were you afraid will be true? The tone of the Mass had shifted. Not outwardly. The chant still floated, the incense still spiraled, but something beneath the ritual had cracked open. The air had grown denser, not oppressive, but charged, as if invisible eyes had joined the congregation, watching, waiting, and the ambassador, once so composed, now began to speak with the brittle sharpness of a man who senses his control slipping and mistakes that loss for someone else's fault. He didn't whisper this time. He didn't conceal his posture or moderate his tone. The cameras weren't on him, but he knew others could hear. "What kind of leader," he said, more loudly now, voice dry with irony, "depends on invisible friends to validate his throne?" Several nearby heads turned. "Is it faith," he continued, "or just fear of letting go?" He smiled afterward, not because he was amused, but because he had to hold the smirk in place to mask what had just stirred inside him. Because he'd seen it. He had seen something, and that vision, whatever it was, terrified him in ways sarcasm could only briefly silence. Pope Leo XIV didn't respond at first. He remained bowed in prayer, lips moving, hands resting on the altar like a soldier resting his hands on the earth he'd sworn to defend. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but every word struck harder than thunder. "I've held children burned in war," he said. "Not just blessed them, held them, their bodies, their silence." He didn't look at the ambassador. He didn't need to. "I've prayed beside men sentenced to die, some guilty, some not. I've listened to their confessions. I've heard what the world never will. I've stood beside mothers who screamed the names of sons lost to hunger, and I had no answer." His voice didn't crack. It deepened. "I have no illusions," he said. "Only hope." The words settled heavily over the basilica. A priest seated near the front lowered his eyes. A cardinal clenched the arms of his chair. Somewhere behind the cameras, a technician forgot to switch to the next broadcast angle. The ambassador remained still, though his jaw had tightened. His cleverness was beginning to betray him. His lines, so confidently rehearsed, so often used to deflect or demean, were starting to ring hollow in the echo of something he could neither dismiss nor define. He tried once more. "Hope is for the weak," he said, almost too quietly. "You use it because you know you've lost the world." This time, the Pope looked at him directly, not with anger, not even disappointment, but with a gaze so patient, so unshakably rooted in something deeper, the ambassador could barely meet it. "Politics divides," the Pope said. "The gospel bleeds. That's the difference." It was not a rebuke. It was a wound shown without shame, and the room felt it. There was no gasp, no uproar, just a tightening in the chest of everyone present, a stillness that followed truth as it always does. Because real truth doesn't shout, it reveals. The ambassador looked away first. He had meant to shake the Pope's authority, to call into question the legitimacy of a faith that dared to speak of angels and sacraments in the modern age. But instead, he had exposed himself. And now the basilica, filled with dignitaries and hierarchy, sat in a kind of suspended silence. A holy discomfort had entered the room, and even the incense seemed to hesitate in the air. If you felt this tension, that place between belief and embarrassment, don't scroll past it. Don't pretend you didn't feel something stir. Because this story isn't about protocol or argument. It's about you. It's not the Pope who's being challenged. It's you. Subscribe to Holy Shadows now, if you're ready for more than comfort. Ready for confrontation, for truth, for mystery. And if you're not, then don't lie to yourself. Go to the comments and say what's holding you back. Confess your hesitation. Name your fear. Because the altar does not flatter us. It reveals us. Then it happened. The moment came, not with thunder or trumpet, not with spectacle, but with a silence so deep it hollowed the entire basilica. The liturgy reached its summit. Every eye turned toward the altar, and Pope Leo XIV, his face lined with prayer and memory, lifted the consecrated host. His hands, steady and unhurried, raised the wafer into the space where heaven and earth meet. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, but in the full expectation that this act tore open the veil of time itself. The chant, slow and ancient, echoed from the choir loft above, stretching like a ribbon through centuries. And as the host reached its apex, held high before the golden cross, the air changed. Not metaphor, not mood. The air itself, its pressure, its temperature, its presence shifted. A light gathered behind the altar, but it did not flare like fire or flicker like flame. It simply was. It grew with the silence, radiant, full, alive, and then resolved into form. Wings, massive, outstretched, folded with a reverence even the architects of the basilica could never have imagined. The figure stood tall behind the Pope, armored, faceless, unspeaking. The sword was sheathed. The hands were folded. But the presence was unmistakable. Some saw nothing. Some saw only light. But others, diplomats, clerics, cameramen, even skeptics, felt it like weight on their souls. And a few saw clearly. The ambassador was among them. He didn't speak. Couldn't. His throat locked. His chest collapsed inward. His eyes widened. Not in wonder, but in terror. Because wonder comes after terror. And he hadn't reached that far yet. He rose halfway, as if to flee, then faltered. His knees hit the marble floor with a sound that broke the rhythm of the liturgy. One of the deacons turned. A gasp echoed near the transept. But Pope Leo did not turn. He did not react. His eyes remained fixed on the host. Because he had seen this before. Because he expected it. The ambassador bowed forward until his forehead touched the stone. He did not weep at first. He shook, then wept. Not from guilt, not yet, but from recognition. Recognition that he had just witnessed something no language could defend against. Something that would never fit into a policy brief or strategy report. Something that undid the scaffolding of the self. The Pope, unflinching, still held the host aloft. He lowered it gently, placed it upon the paten, and then he whispered, Not into the microphone, not into the crowd, but into the space between them. Not a vision, he said. A reminder. The Mass continued, but nothing returned to normal. People shifted in their seats, as if waking from sleep. A few stared at the ceiling above the altar, as if the figure might still be visible. Others bowed their heads, unsure if they were meant to respond. One camera feed quietly cut to black. Another lingered too long on the face of a nun who had begun to cry, and the ambassador remained on his knees. He was not praying. He didn't know how, but he understood, at last, that he had been seen, and that nothing he had ever built in his mind could shield him from what had just looked back. You call it delusion to worship what you can't control? The Pope's words came later, spoken to a gathering behind closed doors, but echoing with the same weight. I call it truth. Truth that humbles even angels. So now ask yourself, are you still here to be entertained? Are you still clinging to the safety of doubt because it keeps you in control? Because if you are, then admit it plainly. You'd rather be amused than transformed. But if something in you is trembling, if even the idea of such a moment awakens something deep in your soul, then it's time. Subscribe now. Not because you agree, not because you're certain, but because some truths are too holy to ignore. And if you still won't, then speak your reason in the comments. Say why this kind of truth unsettles you. But say it with your name. Say it with your soul. The Mass had ended, but the aftermath had only begun. Pope Leo XIV had withdrawn in silence. No victory smile, no crowd wave, no hint of triumph. The host had been consumed, the chalice purified, the final hymn sung. And yet, a deeper liturgy continued beneath the marble, behind the eyes of those who had seen. The ambassador was led, not by protocol, but by necessity. His steps were slow, unsure. He moved like a man who had just stepped out of a burning building, not yet realizing that the fire was not outside him, but within. He was escorted through a side corridor of the basilica, beneath mosaics older than his nation, until he stood before a simple wooden door. Behind it, the Pope, waiting. No press, no audience, no ceremony. The door creaked open, and the ambassador entered. He didn't bow. He didn't speak. He sat. It was the Pope who broke the silence. You saw it. The ambassador didn't nod, didn't confirm, but his eyes said everything. Bloodshot, raw, opened. I saw something, he whispered. But why me? The Pope looked at him, not with scrutiny, but with the gentle certainty of someone who had asked that same question long ago. Because you asked to see, he said, and heaven does not waste invitations. The words landed not like thunder, but like a key turning in a long-forgotten lock. The ambassador looked down, ashamed of how little he had to say now that the debate was over. The clever questions, the strategic framing, the proud disdain, all gone. What remained was a man undone. You believe, he said softly, that all of this matters. The Pope did not hesitate. I don't believe it. I know it. Another pause. And then the pivot, the dismantling not of argument, but of illusion. You think faith is blindness, the Pope said. But faith is not closing your eyes. It is refusing to pretend that we are enough without God. The ambassador looked up. You mistook surrender for weakness, the Pope continued. But surrender to truth is the only strength that does not turn into cruelty. The proud conquer, the meek inherit, and then, quietly, devastatingly, you thought you were immune. But grace does not ask your permission. The words cut deeper than any reprimand, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. And now the ambassador, who had once spoken at international summits, who had drafted treaties with clinical brilliance, who had scoffed at mystics and mocked miracle, sat speechless. He had asked to see, and heaven had answered. Outside the chamber, the ripples had already begun. Word of the apparition had spread faster than Vatican protocol could contain. Priests whispered in corridors. Cardinals texted family members they hadn't spoken to in years. One bishop, a hardened bureaucrat long known for his stoicism, wept openly in the sacristy. A camera feed, broadcasting live to an international news network, suddenly cut mid-sentence, its operator unable to continue. The footage would never reappear in full. And at the edge of the altar, unnoticed by most, a single cardinal, known for his ambition more than his piety, had dropped silently to his knees and buried his face in his hands. It wasn't confession, not yet, but it was something close. The reckoning was quiet, but it had begun. You've heard the dismantling, not of an ideology, not a man, but of every excuse the soul invents to avoid the truth. So now, dismantle your excuses. Subscribe to Holy Shadows if you have even an ounce of courage left. If you can feel the veil lifting, if your spine stiffens at the thought that this might be real, then stop pretending to watch from a distance. Because that distance, it's your soul's last defense. Subscribe now, before you become just another diplomat in the pews, watching and doubting, never choosing. And if you still refuse, if you need to stay clever, guarded, safe, then say so. The comments are open for your confession. But be honest, because heaven does not waste invitations, and it may not offer you another. The basilica had settled back into its solemn rhythm, yet something had shifted irrevocably within its ancient stones. The flickering candles seemed to burn brighter, not with flame alone, but with a new kind of light, one kindled in the hearts of those who witnessed what could not be explained away. Pope Leo XIV stood once more before the altar, his gaze steady and clear, his voice rising over the hush that followed the miracle. This was not a performance, he said slowly, every word deliberate and weighty. No miracle comes to prove. It comes to call. He did not speak to the diplomats, the politicians, or even the cameras that captured the event. He spoke to something far greater, the invisible souls gathered in that vast cathedral, and the millions watching beyond its walls. To you who watch and wonder, know this. You may never see wings above the altar, but you can kneel before the same host. You can bow your heart to the same mystery. He raised his hands in blessing, not as a gesture of triumph, but as one of invitation. The grace of that moment was not confined to saints or visionaries. It was for the broken, the doubtful, the weary. St. Michael appeared not to terrify, but to remind us, this world is not abandoned. The words hung in the air, a balm and a summons intertwined. It was a call to awaken from complacency, to stand with courage in a world desperate for light. If you are still here, still listening, then you are meant to hear this. Subscribe now to Holy Shadows. Let every video be a candle in the dark, a spark of truth for a world starving for clarity. And if you refuse, if you choose silence over illumination, then tell us in the comments. Tell us what chain you will not break, what fear holds you captive, what truth you deny, because the altar is waiting, and the wings remain unseen by many, but they are never absent. What would you have done if you were there, in that vast basilica, beneath the soaring arches, with the light of a miracle casting shadows where doubt once lived? Would you have fallen to your knees, tears streaming as the diplomat did, broken by the weight of the unseen? Or would you have looked away, shielding yourself from a truth too raw to bear? The choice is yours. The moment belongs not to saints or skeptics, but to those willing to face what lies beyond comfort. Let your voice join this testimony. The comments are open, but only the honest should enter. Speak not to impress, but to confess, to wrestle, to admit fear or faith, because transformation begins with truth spoken aloud. May we all learn to kneel before truth, before mystery, and before the God who still sends angels to remind us. If you have made it this far, do not leave unchanged. Subscribe to Holy Shadows. Don't just watch stories of transformation, live one. And if you cannot yet embrace that, then explain your resistance below. Lay bare your reasons, because this is not the end. It is your beginning.